You wake up. It's the year 1348. You reach for something by your bed, something you use every single day. But what you don't know is that this tiny normal action is a literal death sentence. You think you're cleaning yourself, but you're actually taking part in a daily ritual that turned the entire world into a graveyard. This year, the Black Death will kill a crazy number of people, not because of some unstoppable force, but because everyday life, the streets, the water, even the clothes you share, became a giant, super-efficient machine for spreading disease. The year 1347 is when everything went wrong. Trading ships pulled into Europe, but they weren't just carrying spices, they were secretly carrying rats, and those rats were carrying fleas, and those fleas were carrying a bacteria called Yersinia pestis. In just 3 years, it destroyed the continent, killing up to 60% of everyone living there. We call it the Black Death, which sounds epic and random, but it wasn't random at all. The plague was an opportunist, and it took advantage of a world where the line between clean and disgusting basically didn't exist. We think of the Middle Ages as this cool time with castles and knights, but for almost everyone, it was actually insane. People lived surrounded by filth in a way we can't even imagine today. It wasn't just a virus. The plague had help from the way people lived. The normal things they did every day, eating, sleeping, cleaning their homes, created the perfect storm for the plague to absolutely explode, killing an estimated 25 million people. This isn't just about one person getting sick. It's about thousands of tiny, everyday habits that added up to create the deadliest pandemic in history. The craziest part is that people in 1348 weren't trying to be dirty. They just had no idea what clean actually meant. They thought diseases were carried in bad air, so they walked around with flowers trying to smell something nice. But the real killer wasn't in the air. It was in the garbage under their feet, on their skin, and inside their own houses. This is the story of how the most normal, everyday habits became the biggest mistakes of their lives. Section 1. The street as a sewer. I want you to picture walking through a city like London in 1348. The first thing you'd notice isn't the buildings, it's the smell. It would be an insane mix of smoke, animal poop, and human waste. The streets aren't paved. They're just mud, and the ground is literally layers of disgusting stuff, rotting straw, animal guts, and garbage. And running through it all are streams of pure sewage coming directly from the houses. The toilet back then was a chamber pot, and when it was full, you just chucked it out the window. People would yell, "Gardes low! Watch out for the water!" and just dump everything into the street. This wasn't lazy. This was literally how everyone got rid of their poop. Some places had public pits, but they would overflow with rain, sending waves of human waste flooding the streets. The result was a city literally drowning in its own trash. And all this filth created the perfect breeding ground for the plague's biggest allies, rats. Rats love garbage, and the streets of 1348 were an all-you-can-eat buffet. This attracted huge numbers of the exact same rats that came over on the ships. And with the rats came the fleas. Here's how insane this is. The plague bacteria, Yersinia pestis, lives in fleas. A flea bites an infected rat, and the bacteria blocks up its stomach. The starving flea then jumps to the nearest person and bites them over and over, spitting the plague right into their blood. By turning the streets into a paradise for rats, people were basically inviting millions of plague-infected rodents to come live with them. But it gets worse. All this sewage would flow directly into the rivers and wells people used for drinking water. Years later, a law was passed in England complaining that all the dung and filth was making the air greatly corrupt and infected. So while the plague was the main killer, dirty water caused other diseases like dysentery and typhoid. If you were already sick with the plague, getting another disease was game over. The simple act of emptying a bucket of waste was feeding the exact system that was killing millions. The streets weren't just dirty, they were a city-wide death trap that people built themselves, the enemy on your skin. If the streets were the plague's headquarters, the human body was its getaway car. In the 14th century, being clean was nothing like it is today. Most people were just permanently covered in a layer of dirt, sweat, and bugs. This made the human body the perfect bridge for the plague to get from the rat-infested street into your house. Taking a full-body bath was a massive luxury. You had to drag all the water by hand and then spend a ton of time and effort heating it. There were public bathhouses, but people thought they were sketchy, and during a plague, they correctly guessed they were hotspots for disease. What's even crazier is that doctors actually told people not to bathe. They believed in that bad air theory, and they thought hot water would open your pores and let the plague in. It was a lose-lose situation. They were afraid that the one thing that could have actually helped them would get them sick. Because of this, almost everyone had fleas and lice. It was just a normal part of life. They lived in your clothes, your bed, and on your body. And while we always hear the rat-flea-human story, some scientists now think that human fleas and lice were spreading the plague directly from person to person. If you never washed your clothes, you were basically a walking hotel for these bugs. A flea could bite you, then jump to your kid or your spouse, and boom, the entire family is infected. Rich people had more options, but they weren't much better. They might take private baths, but they'd do it in stuff like vinegar and rosewater, hoping it would fight the bad air. Some people even followed insane advice to bathe in urine, thinking it was a disinfectant. And while that might have done a little something, it did nothing to stop the fleas. The only real advantage the rich had was linen underwear, which they could wash. Most people just wore heavy wool clothes for weeks or months without ever washing them, letting them get packed with dirt and bugs. Religion made it even more complicated. A lot of people thought the plague was a punishment from God, so they just gave up. Some super religious people even thought being dirty was a sign of being holy. They would intentionally not wash to show they didn't care about worldly things. So you'd have a person carrying sweet-smelling flowers to fight the bad air, while their own body was a walking ecosystem for the plague's real messengers. Failing to just take a bath meant that when the plague showed up, it found a home on every single person, ready to be carried right into their house. Section 3. The killer in your home. If the streets were the source and your skin was the bridge, the medieval home was the place where the plague trapped and killed everyone. A typical family, sometimes with their animals, lived crammed into one tiny room with a dirt floor and almost no windows. The floors were covered in straw that was never changed, so it just became a disgusting mat of garbage, food scraps, and animal poop, a perfect nest for rats and fleas. People slept on straw beds that were also filled with bugs. This leads to a really gross question. With no toilet paper and no water, what did people use? It's hard to know for sure, but people probably used things like moss, leaves, or cloth scraps. But cloth was super valuable. It's terrifying to think about, but it's likely that a single wiping rag would be shared by an entire family. They might rinse it in a bowl of gross, cold water, but it was never, ever clean. This one habit would have been absolutely catastrophic. The plague caused horrible diarrhea, so an infected person's waste was incredibly contagious. If a sick person used the shared cloth, they would smear bacteria all over it. The next family member to use it would literally be wiping the plague directly onto themselves. This created a super fast way to spread the disease through a house, which is why entire families would get wiped out. And the medical cures made everything a billion times worse. Doctors believed the plague swellings, called buboes, were filled with poison that needed to come out. So, their main treatment was to cut them open. In reality, these buboes were packed with pus that was swarming with Yersinia pestis bacteria. Lancing them would spray this hyper-infectious goo everywhere, on the patient, the bed, and anyone trying to help. A family member trying to care for their loved one was basically getting a face full of the plague. Finally, as millions of people died, they couldn't even bury the bodies fast enough. They dug giant mass graves, but they were so full that bodies would be piled up shallowly. People wrote about dogs dragging corpses out of the pits and back into the streets. The home, which was supposed to be a safe place, was actually the plague's most deadly trap. Once it got inside, almost no one made it out alive. But in the middle of this absolute nightmare, something strange was happening, something that didn't seem to fit the pattern of death sweeping across the continent. while entire towns were collapsing, while families were vanishing within days, while carts piled high with bodies rolled endlessly through the streets, there were certain groups of people who, against all odds, were surviving at noticeably higher rates. Across Europe, whispers began to spread. People started noticing that in some places, Jewish communities were not dying at the same catastrophic levels as everyone else. At first, it didn't make sense. The plague didn't care about status, wealth, or power. It wiped out peasants and nobles alike. So why would one group be different? This reveals one of the biggest hidden truths of the entire pandemic, something so simple yet so powerful that it would take centuries for the rest of the world to fully understand it. Basic hygiene actually worked. They weren't magically immune. There was no secret medicine, no hidden cure, no divine shield protecting them from disease. The difference came from something far more grounded in everyday life. Their religion required cleanliness, not occasionally, not when convenient, but constantly as a strict and unavoidable part of daily routine. Jewish law included detailed rules about hygiene, especially ritual hand-washing. These weren't suggestions, they were obligations. People had to wash their hands when they woke up, after using the bathroom, before eating, and in many other situations throughout the day. It wasn't about comfort or preference, it was about discipline, about following a system that had been passed down for generations. Now compare that to the average person living in medieval Europe. For many, washing hands wasn't even considered important. Some people might rinse their hands once a day, if that. Bathing itself was often avoided, sometimes out of fear that it would make them more vulnerable to illness. The concept of invisible germs simply didn't exist. To them, disease came from bad air, from curses, or from divine punishment, not from the things they touched or the filth they lived in. So while one group was unknowingly breaking the chain of infection again and again, others were unknowingly reinforcing it every single day. We can't overstate how much of a game changer this was. Every time hands were washed, the spread of bacteria was interrupted. Every time food was prepared with cleaner practices, another opportunity for infection was eliminated. Every time bodies were handled with care and buried quickly, another source of contamination was removed. Meanwhile, outside these communities, the opposite was happening. Streets were filled with garbage. Dead bodies were left exposed. Rats and fleas thrived in environments that humans had no idea were dangerous. It was a perfect storm, a system designed, without anyone realizing it, to spread death as efficiently as possible. Jewish communities also followed rules around food preparation that reduced contamination. They emphasized cleanliness in kitchens, separation of certain foods, and proper handling practices. These weren't designed as anti-plague measures. They were religious traditions. But they had a powerful side effect. They reduced the spread of disease. They also buried their dead quickly and respectfully, avoiding the kind of overcrowded, decaying mass graves that became common elsewhere. In many cities, bodies were stacked on top of each other, left to rot, creating even more opportunities for infection to spread. But in communities with stricter burial practices, this risk was significantly reduced. In a world where most people had no idea what was actually causing the plague, these habits acted like an invisible shield. But here's where the story takes a dark and horrifying turn. Because instead of learning from this difference, instead of asking questions, instead of observing and adapting, people became suspicious. In a time of fear, logic often disappears. And in a time of mass death, people don't just look for answers, they look for someone to blame. The fact that Jewish communities were surviving at higher rates didn't appear as a clue. It appeared as evidence of something sinister. To terrified populations watching their world collapse, it seemed impossible that this could be coincidence or discipline. It had to be intentional. Rumors began to spread like wildfire. People started claiming that Jewish individuals were poisoning wells, that they were somehow responsible for the plague itself, that they were using secret knowledge not to protect themselves, but to destroy others. None of this was true. But in a world already consumed by panic, truth didn't matter. An insane wave of violence swept across Europe. Entire communities were targeted, homes were burned, families were dragged into the streets. People who had done nothing more than follow their daily routines, habits that were actually helping them survive, were suddenly accused of being the cause of the very disaster they were enduring. This led to massacres on a massive scale. In some cities, entire Jewish populations were wiped out. Thousands of people were murdered based on fear, misinformation, and desperation. The irony is almost unbearable. The very people whose daily habits were a literal blueprint for survival were instead blamed and killed for it. It is one of the most tragic and disturbing moments in all of history. And yet, even in the middle of all this chaos, something else was beginning to happen. A few people, very few, started to notice patterns. They didn't fully understand what was going on, but they could see that certain actions seemed to make a difference. That maybe, just maybe, there was a connection between cleanliness and survival. One of the earliest examples of this shift happened in an Italian city called Pistoia. In 1348, as the plague raged around them, the government of Pistoia made a series of decisions that were unlike anything seen before. They created new laws, rules that, for the first time, tried to control how people interacted with death and disease. They banned large funerals. They limited gatherings. They introduced regulations around how bodies should be handled. Corpses had to be sealed in coffins. They had to be buried in deep graves away from living spaces. At the time, these rules may have seemed extreme, even unnecessary. But, looking back, they were revolutionary. These were some of the very first steps toward what we now call public health. For the first time, people were beginning to understand that disease wasn't just random. It could be influenced by human behavior. They didn't know about bacteria. They didn't know about germs. But they were starting to see that certain actions made things worse and others made things better. And all of this knowledge, every single step forward, was paid for in suffering. The plague forced people to confront the reality they had ignored for centuries, that living in filth had consequences. It's almost impossible to imagine just how different daily life was back then. Things we take for granted today, things so basic we don't even think about them, simply didn't exist. Soap wasn't widely used. Sewage systems were primitive or non-existent. Waste was thrown into the streets. Clean water wasn't always accessible. Even the idea of washing hands regularly was not part of everyday thinking. And yet today, these things are so normal that we barely notice them. Washing your hands, flushing a toilet, taking a shower, cleaning your kitchen. These aren't just habits. They are the result of centuries of trial, error, and tragedy. Back in 1348, these simple actions would have been the difference between life and death. And that's what makes this moment in history so powerful, because it shows how something invisible, something people couldn't see, couldn't understand, couldn't even imagine, was controlling everything. The Black Death wasn't just a random disaster that appeared out of nowhere. It was a perfect storm. The bacteria that caused it was just the spark. The real fuel was the way people lived. The daily habits of medieval society created an environment where the plague could spread faster than anything the world had ever seen. Throwing trash into the streets created ideal conditions for rats. Rats carried fleas. Fleas carried the bacteria. People avoided bathing, which allowed fleas to live on their bodies longer. Homes were crowded, meaning one infected person could quickly infect an entire family. Every small action, every normal habit became part of a system that accelerated death. And the most terrifying part? No one knew. They weren't stupid. They weren't careless. They were simply working with the wrong understanding of the world. They believed in bad air, in curses, in divine punishment. Meanwhile, the real enemy was hiding in plain sight, living in their homes, in their clothes, in their streets. But from all of this suffering, something began to change. Slowly, painfully, over generations, people started to learn. They started to question old beliefs. They started to observe patterns. They started to build new systems based on what actually worked. This was the beginning of a long transformation. The shift from superstition to science, from chaos to control. The world didn't change overnight, but it did change. And everything we have today, every system, every habit, every piece of knowledge about health and hygiene can be traced back, in some way, to moments like this. Moments where humanity was forced to confront its own mistakes. Moments where survival depended not on strength or luck, but on understanding. The memory of 1348 is not just a story about death, it's a story about learning the hard way. It's a reminder that history isn't only shaped by kings, wars, or great inventions. Sometimes it's shaped by the smallest things. The things people do every single day without thinking. The silent choices, the invisible habits, the unnoticed details. Because sometimes, those are the things that matter most.